This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, True Detective Season 3, Coffee with a Cop, and Testing Blood. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. This is episode 26 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. If you have your own authored business, consider joining Patreon. It's free for you, and it allows your readers to support you financially through monthly micropayments. Give your fans a chance to show their support by creating your own Patreon account right now. To learn more, visit writersdetective.com/Patreon, Patreon. Real quick, I want to give a special thank you to Gold Shield patron Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com for supporting the show at the Gold Shield level. Deborah is a prolific author, having created many different urban fantasy fiction series. In fact, if you're a Kindle Unlimited member, check out the first book in Deborah's White Lightning series. It's called Wooden Nickels. Moonshine, mobsters, and mages in the 1920s. That sounds awesome. So the Gold Shield tier of patronage, which Deborah just joined, includes 2 Gold Shield members-only live streams per month, which we can use for Q&A, story help, or whatever you want to talk about. Most importantly, I want to thank my OPs, my original patrons, Joan Raymond, Guy Alton, Natasha Bajema, who, by the way, just launched the Authors of Mass Destruction podcast. So if you write about WMDs, definitely give that a listen. Natalie Borelli, Joe Trent, Siobhan Pope, Leah Cutter, Ryan Kinmill, Richard Phillips, Robin Lyons, Jean Desrochers, and Craig Kingsman. Your support for the show means so much to me. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So as a listener, please support all of these awesome authors by visiting their author websites and reading their books. You can find links to their websites in the show notes at writersdetective.com/26. Speaking of support, last week we hit over 5,000 downloads, and we're nearly at 6,000 as I'm recording this. I'm horrible at taking the time to pause and recognize small wins like that, but I wanted to stop for a second and just say thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming back every week, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your friends. 5,000 downloads for our little podcast. This milestone would not have been possible without you, quite literally. You are awesome. And don't forget, this podcast is for you. I know you have questions, so please send them in. Just go to writersdetective.com/podcast and go ahead and ask away. I don't know about you, but I am a fan of HBO's show True Detective. Season 3 launched a few weeks ago, and I think I'm on episode 3. I'm a little behind. Now, don't worry, there are no spoilers in what I'm going to talk about. But if you're a fan of how season 1 unfolded with the timeline, then you'll be happy to hear that season 3 of True Detective uses a similar storytelling technique. Mahershala Ali gives an amazing performance that you will definitely want to see. But the reason I want to talk about season 3 of True Detective has to do with how you choose to write your own stories. Now, I promise no spoilers, but I am going to reveal that the basic premise, the inciting incident of the entire season, is that 2 children go missing. I promise I'm not ruining anything about the story by telling you this. So I promise no spoilers, but I'm going to reveal that the basic premise, the inciting incident of the entire season, is that 2 children go missing. Now, I promise I'm not ruining anything about the story by telling you this. So the children go off on their bikes and they're told to be home by sunset. This is pretty much how I grew up, and I imagine many of you did too. From about the time I was 10 years old or so, my bicycle was my freedom. I had a paper route. I rode to and from school on it. I went all over the place on my bike. I was out of the house all the time. Honestly, it's something I should probably be doing again now. But if I didn't come home on time, what happened? I'm sure it was the same for you. Your parents would call your friends' houses and try to figure out where you were. Of course, this was, for me, landline era. And then, some parents, if they were worrywarts, might call hospitals, to make sure they get that good guilt trip in when you finally made it home. But if you didn't make it home, ultimately your parents called the police to report you as missing. And if that happened, you knew it was going to be your hide when you got home. Anyway, when the police get called, what really happens? So an officer comes and takes a report. And now there are laws that require the officer to enter the kids' names and information into the missing person database, which is abbreviated as MUPS, M-U-P-S. That's the abbreviation for the missing person database. But the kids have to be entered into the MUPS database within 4 hours of the report. Now, this law probably was not in effect in the 1980s, both when I was a kid riding around on my bicycle and when this season of True Detective, the story begins. So, what would happen next after that entry into the missing person system? Then the officer would broadcast a be on the lookout on the police radio for those missing kids. And that would be about it, at least for that evening. So whether it was the 1980s or if this happens tonight, would you really expect the entire police department to come out with all of their lights flashing? Would search parties be mustered immediately? Is it realistic to believe the entire effort of the police department would be thrust into searching for 2 kids that are late in getting home? Of course not. And this is especially the case if neither of the kids were considered to be at risk and if the parents were just normal people. And when I say normal people, I mean they weren't trying to exert some sort of political influence over the police department to treat this as a bigger deal than it really was. Yet, in True Detective, the lights are flashing all across the neighborhood. Police cars are crisscrossing. Dozens of uniformed extras are knocking on doors and filling up the screen to show you that the search is on. Is this realistic? No. And you know what? I don't care that it isn't realistic. I want the story to get moving. This is the inciting incident. It's designed to catapult us, the readers or the viewers, into the story. No one is going to turn off the TV because there are too many cops out searching too early in the story. But if the creators of the story delayed the entire scene until later in the timeline for realism's sake, you can bet viewers would switch channels because it would be boring. The lesson here is that story comes first. Keep your story moving forward. Obviously, realism in crime fiction is important. That's why this podcast exists. And especially when it comes to plot holes or ruining the suspension of disbelief. But do not get too mired in the boring details. In fact, when I was watching this episode of True Detective, I didn't even have that familiar, oh yeah, right, kind of reaction when this scene happened. I was too wrapped up in the story. It wasn't until afterward that I thought about it from a writing perspective and what lessons I could pull from it. So that's the lesson. The story comes first. Use realism to create interest, add grittiness, and avoid those oh yeah, right reactions that I just talked about. But don't let realism suck the life out of your story. This week's first question comes from Carlos Wayne, and that's Carlos with a K, and you can find him on Amazon, and there will be a link in the show notes at writersdetective.com/26 to Carlos's Amazon page. Carlos asks, how do you approach a police station, an officer, or a PI to give you information about cases for your writing? Now, I want to start with a cautionary note for anyone outside of the United States. The first part of Carlos's question, how do you approach a police station, brought back a very vivid memory of a trip I took in 2001. Actually, it was July of 01, so 2 months before 9/11. I was traveling through Europe, and I was trading police shoulder patches with all of the cops that I met on the street. In most of Europe, their shoulder patches are Velcroed on, so it was pretty easy to trade patches, not like the States where they're sewn on. Anyway, at one point on the trip, I was on a cruise and we had a stop in Kusadasi, Turkey, which is on the Aegean coast. And there was a police station close to the port. And just as Carlos says, I approached the police station, which was a 2-story square building. It was set back from the street about 30 feet, which created a small parking lot in front of the building. And I remember that the front door was in the center of the facade and it was standing open because I could see that there was a metal detector, just like you'd see at an airport, just inside the door frame. And as I was focused on this, walking into the parking lot, a uniformed police officer put his left hand up in the international symbol of stop. Now, his right hand was wrapped around the pistol grip of an MP5 submachine gun, which was slung over his shoulder. Now, he wasn't pointing the barrel at me or anything, but I immediately stopped and put my palms up in the international symbol of don't shoot me, I'm not a threat. I quickly explained I was there to trade law enforcement shoulder patches, so that little bit of tension eased really quickly. So to finish off the story and not beleaguer it too long, I had to come back to get the patch from the chief of investigations later on in the afternoon, which ended up being about 10 minutes before our cruise ship was set to leave the port. So I did get the patch, but I was pressed for time, which was really unfortunate because the chief of investigations invited me up for tea and a tour of the station. But unfortunately, I had to decline in order to make it back to the ship for departure. Anyway, it turned out to be a great experience, and the police could not have been more hospitable and inviting other than the submachine gun introduction. But anyway, that kind of sums up what it's like to be a police officer anywhere in the world. You try to be as kind and considerate as you can, but you must remain vigilant to the fact that you are a target and there are people that do want to kill you just for being a cop. So let my little anecdote there serve as a word of caution for blindly approaching a police station, especially overseas. There's certainly stories in the news media right now, current events. I'm looking at you, Northern Ireland, where things are starting to go back to the roughneck ways of the 1980s, I fear. So even in the first world countries, we might see some pretty significant posture changes around police stations here in the very near future if it hasn't happened already. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be smart and recognize that an unfamiliar face approaching the building will be treated with suspicion until they understand what you want. So just my use of the word they kind of illustrates that separation of the police from the rest of society. It's a subculture, if you will. Now, in the U.S. police departments are trying across the country to work on creating opportunities for community members to meet their cops in a more relaxed and friendly environment. See, when we meet most people, or when most people encounter a cop, it's usually a sign of a bad day. You got a ticket, you were the victim of a crime, we just kicked down your door, or the absolute worst is we're delivering the worst kind of news that you can get. So we, the police, have begun to try to create a positive interaction or interactions with our community members. And the latest trend has been coffee with a cop meetups. This is when the police department announces a date and a time at a local coffee shop where the community is invited to stop by for a cup of coffee and have a chat. There's no agenda other than a chance to meet and talk with a friendly face in uniform. So this is a great way, as a writer, to connect with a police officer for future conversations. The officer will already have his or her happy face on, if you will, and the department will generally send their more outgoing officers, hopefully not Officer Grumpy Face. Plus, when you explain that you're writing fiction, the officer at the Coffee with a Cop event will be secretly relieved that this conversation isn't about another problem the police need to solve. You aren't complaining about speeders in your neighborhood or how nothing's being done about fill in the blank. Obviously, you probably won't be able to conduct a full-on interview during this meeting, but it's a great way to make that connection. Trade business cards, phone numbers, email addresses, or whatever, and ask if you can make an appointment to talk more. If you've ever watched an episode of Cops or Live PD, you'll know that cops love to talk about themselves. I cringe every time the cop is driving and talking to the camera about the job. Ugh. Anyway, knowing this, though, is a very useful tactic for getting the officer to open up to you. Ask them questions about themselves. How long have you worked for the department? Did you always want to be a police officer? What's the most memorable call you've been on? Things like that show you're interested in their answer, and it kind of strokes their ego. But more importantly, it butters them up for more conversations one-on-one. So I encourage you to get out of your comfort zone. Go talk to those friendly officers at the next Coffee with a Cop meetup in your neighborhood. Ask story starter questions and ask to talk more after the event and trade that contact information. You might even be surprised how many cops have a secret desire to get into writing. I also urge you to go to more than one of these Coffee with a Cop events, especially if it's with a different police or sheriff's department. You'll meet new people at each event, and eventually you will get that interview you're hoping for. And to go back to Carlos's original question, the last part, when you do get a chance to ask more in-depth questions, don't be too specific about the cases. If you focus on building the rapport between the two of you, you can start delving into more detailed questions once some trust has been built. I should also mention that in episode 3 of this podcast, I also talked about being able to network with cops through a Citizens Academy. And then I also revealed my super ninja stealth tactic of literally getting your foot in the door at the department by volunteering to work as the crime blotter writer for your local newspaper. So to learn more details on that, check out episode 3. You can go to writersdetective.com/3. That's the number 3. Or by scrolling to episode 3 in the backlist through your favorite podcast app. So thank you so much for the question, Carlos. That was Carlos Wayne, and you can find a link to his Amazon page in the show notes at writersdetective.com/26. And this week's next question comes from K.A. Lugo again, and you can find her work at jackslaughterthrillers.com. K.A. writes, "Thank you for answering my previous question about procedure when a former officer is detained at a murder scene he's discovered. It really helped my scene." You're very welcome, K.A. My new question is about blood. Because my PI came in contact with the victim's blood, what procedures will officials take after basic swabbing for evidence? Will the forensic tests be done at the scene, or will my PI have the swabs done at the precinct? Now that the tests are done, what, if any, procedures do officials take to remove the blood from my PI's hands? Are there any measures taken to ensure my PI's hands are properly clean to prevent HIV at that point, or is it all on this witness to clean up properly? Will tests be automatically taken of the blood to see if the HIV virus is present? How soon are those tests performed? Will they be performed more expediently because the PI had direct contact with the blood? How long do those results take to come back? And finally, will my PI still have to get tested after the 4-month HIV incubation period, even if that forensic test shows the victim was clean? Thanks for your expert advice. Have a great day. K.A. Lugo. Well, the short answer is the police wouldn't test the blood on the PI's hands. In fact, the first priority should be getting the blood off of Jack's hands because the blood is a biohazard. They may collect Jack's clothes as evidence during the interview at the station, but that would be about it. And I should interject here that Jack is the PI that K.A. is writing about. The bloody clothing would be booked likely in a brown paper evidence bag to allow the blood to dry. Picture a brown paper grocery bag, but with a stamp or a sticker on it with the word evidence at the top and then all of the case information filled in underneath. Now, that bag would be stapled shut and sealed with evidence tape and probably the signature or initials of the officer booking the evidence across that evidence tape. I should mention they would not use a plastic bag for booking any kind of bloody evidence because it's not breathable. So the evidence inside would not get a chance to dry. Even if it did dry, you then end up with the possibility of mold. So it's almost always in a paper bag. So whether the lab actually tests that blood on the clothing will be determined later by the detectives, and that's going to be based on whether they think they need to or not. It sounds pretty obvious that the blood came from the victim that Jack was standing over, and that's how it got on his clothing. So unless those facts are called into question somehow, there really isn't a need to test that blood at all. As for the HIV concerns, that's going to be on Jack to have his own blood tested. Now, he doesn't have to get it tested, but he's smart enough a character to want to get it tested, so that would be on his own volition. Now, he wouldn't get any info from the police officially anyway, about whether the victim was HIV positive. Now, if one of his former partners passes along that information on the sly, it would have come from the toxicology testing done as part of the autopsy. And I should mention that it wouldn't be that they are doing a specific HIV test on the decedent's blood. Rather, it would be that HIV was one of many things that the blood panel would be screening for. And the results would come back with the rest of the tox screen. So you can use your creative license to decide when that happens. It's usually a matter of days, but it can be weeks if there's a backlog. So I hope this helps, K.A., and thank you so much for the question. Again, you can find K.A. Lugo at jackslaughterthrillers.com. Thank you so much for listening this week. We are so close to 6,000 downloads, and 10,000 is right around the corner. If you would do me the huge favor of telling your friends or anybody that's interested in writing about this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great week, and I will see you next week. In the meantime, write well.